So, one of the problems I have with historical periodization, like thinking about the Middle Ages as a separate entity versus the Renaissance as a separate entity, is it's not very realistic. If you're an ordinary person living in northern Italy in the 1420s, you're not waking up every morning thinking, I'm so glad that my lifespan overlaps with the European Renaissance and not the Middle Ages. That's just not how things work. These are gradual shifts that, in the rearview mirror of history, so to speak, historians can look back and see an accumulation of trends and transitions happening. So what I'm about to get into here, don't think of it as an abrupt shift. It's very gradual, and many people in everyday life, most people in everyday life, are probably never going to notice it. It raises an interesting question, though, when we look at our own lives. What sort of big meta trends are we living through that we don't know are happening? So I want to begin this transition, to put it in context, by looking at the Black Death. This is what we closed off large group talking about on Tuesday. But the effects of the Black Death, particularly social effects of the Black Death, as it ravaged throughout Europe, that really is at the core to understanding the emergence of the European Renaissance. On the whole, if you were to look at Europe, somewhere between a third and half the population, in some smaller locations it's even a bigger fraction than that, are going to perish over a course of decades in the 1300s, that the plague is really going to reach its peak. Also, during this time period, during the Black Death, the church is going to lose some of its power and prestige that it once wielded during the Middle Ages for a variety of reasons. There's going to be the psychological sting and trauma of seeing things like mass graves and the inability to bury and process those dead bodies that the Black Death is going to just inflict upon the people who lived through it. In many cases, you're going to see the dislocation and disruption of families. The terror of the Black Death will cause many people and family arrangements to spread out. If portions of your family become sick, you may abandon them. You may take flight, go to another city, town, flee the area that you've always grown up in. That's going to be common and very disruptive in a lot of ways. Anti-Semitism, the hatred, persecution of Jews, and which are a minority group in almost every place they exist in Europe, is going to increase during and after the Black Death. There's going to be an uptick in anti-Semitism. And also, can't overstate this one enough. The population as a whole is going to take multiple centuries to rebound. Europe kind of reaches a population apogee or peak around the year 1300. There had been a relative slow but steady growth throughout the early Middle Ages, which is kind of counterintuitive. We don't think of the Middle Ages being a time of growth, population-wise, but there had been up to that point. It takes a sudden dip, and it's not going to be until around the year 1617, in some cases as late as 1800, that population is going to rebound. These aren't the best graphs to see that, but you can see this dip in the number of people globally, and also in Europe primarily, that are going to go down during this span. So if you're living in the early 1400s, you're living in a world that's eerily depopulated. You're living in a world where you could walk into a city, or you can walk into the countryside and see fields that are unplowed and untended. Cities that are partially or nearly fully abandoned. This is going to be a very odd way of looking at the world that people during this time period in the wake of the Black Death would have been able to. In addition to social consequences, we have economic consequences, which is there's going to be a lower price on goods because there's going to be less demand, less market demand for many goods because there are less mouths to feed in a lot of ways. There's going to be a growth in cities after the Black Death. There's going to be a kind of a movement from people in the countryside to more urban centers. And you're going to see a gradual, I repeat, gradual end in feudalism. That term that you explored in your book reading last week. And there are a number of reasons for this. Any sort of social system is going to take a while to usually undo itself. So here are some reasons that I'd put forth on why feudalism kind of breaks apart as a system. And Here's one. After the Black Death, the less availability of people, of serfs and peasants. That's a terrible thing for the people who lived through that death and trauma of the Black Death. But in the wake of that, if you happen to be one of the lucky few who survived, you're not only in a better position, I should say, because you survived physically, or your ancestor survived, but it means that your position in relation to the labor market is better, because you're in demand. Those fields that need to be planted with wheat, and those animals that need to be tended, and all of those mechanical devices and construction projects that need to happen, they still are going to happen, but you're going to be more likely to be compensated for your labor. In the Middle Ages, when there is a large amount of unfree serf peasants populating the countryside, there's going to be less of an incentive to pay them wages or to give them any sort of compensation. So long story short, if you're in a position of doing physical manual labor after the Black Death, you're in a stronger negotiating power. It means that some lord or someone with money is more likely to pay you because they don't have a lot of other options. You're going to see a rise in wages. There's a labor scarcity going on out there, so you're going to have to pay people to do things that you might have paid them less in the past to do. Some other ancillary things going on, technologically speaking, that's going to put an end to feudalism is gunpowder and artillery are going to come about. You're going to get a reading on Monday that's going to talk about how that changes the political scene. Long story short, all of those castle walls that were built during the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages, they're going to be less of an obstacle if you can blast them down with artillery, essentially, if gunpowder becomes available. And as a result, kings are going to see their power go up in relation to the lords and nobles. Lords and nobles during the Middle Ages could play a really kind of equal game with kings, because as long as they had a castle and they had enough loyalty from a warrior class of knights behind them, they could hold out indefinitely against a king. But if the king now has the wealth and ability to invest in things like gunpowder and artillery and build armies to roam throughout the countryside, he can pressure nobles to fall in line with his wishes. And this is going to restore and increase the power of kings. So they're going to come out of the Renaissance in a much stronger position. Science and medicine, there's less superstition overall. Still a fair amount of that going on, and witchcraft is still going to be a thing into the 16 and 1700s in many parts of Europe, but less of it overall, certainly amongst intellectual circles. And there's going to be a more openness to dissecting corpses and having a greater understanding of the human anatomy. There's going to be some major gains made there in the 15 and 1600s in particular. And more desire to experiment, try new things, ideas, techniques, and exchange those. So you get the emergence of what we call the Renaissance. Renaissance is a French word meaning rebirth. And again, this is not affecting everyone. In many cases, only the top tiers of society who are engaged in intellectual pursuits or commercial pursuits or political ongoings are going to experience this. But you see these changes. The church is going to become more and more challenged. It's going to lose its grip that it once held during the Middle Ages. Trade and competition are going to lead to the growth of a middle class. Anytime you see a growing middle class, it's usually a far more dynamic society. More experimentation and interaction with the marketplace and ideas are going to be circulating generally. There's going to be increased travel and more money to spend. Currency, coinage, the availability of it is going to make a big comeback in Europe. And there's going to be a change in overall attitudes and values, which I'll illustrate in detail in a bit. But the Renaissance, like I said, it's going to be a rebirth, so to speak. So where does it happen? If you were looking for a place to see the Renaissance happening at its earliest possible moment, you would look to Italy. Italy is not a country during the 13 and 1400s. Italy is going to be one of the last European nation states to form as a unified political entity in the 1870s. Much, much later. If you went back to the 13 and 1400s in Italy, you would find a grab bag of small city-states, Territories of land usually controlled by one family or a handful of families that usually had their own independent military forces, and in many cases they'd be at war with one another. Some of these include the very powerful city-state of Venice, which is going to have a large merchant fleet that's going to travel all over the Mediterranean. Naples in the south, the Kingdom of Naples. The Republic of Genoa, which is going to be another maritime sailing merchant society. Florence is going to be a very powerful one, Padua. And then, of course, the city of Rome, which is the home base of what very powerful institution? Rome is the home base of what institution? Yeah. The Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican, the Pope, who's going to be a big political player during this time. So, the Italian city-states is where we look to see these transitions happening first. And that's because it is the most logical, the most obvious trading center. If a trading center is ever going to really reemerge, it's probably going to happen in Italy because it's kind of geographically positioned quite well to be a trading society. Lots of port cities located on a peninsula right in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea where commerce is going to naturally flow. You wouldn't look necessarily to central Germany as an obvious trading center. You would, however, look to Italy. So wealth is going to be more and more accumulated in these areas. And let me give you a little insight into how wealth is accumulated in these Italian. So this is kind of a micro example, the transition from Roman to Arabic numerals. It's kind of a micro example of how the Renaissance is really happening because of an influx and wider availability of knowledge and interaction with other cultures that just didn't happen on that type of a scale during the Middle Ages. And I bring that example out to show not only the growth in economics and trade, but also just the transition and transmission of ideas, rather. So you're going to see also during this time, as the clip showed, and we're going to see more in a bit, is the emergence of credit. The ability and availability of loans, essentially. Money that you get today with the expectation that you pay back at some defined date in the future with interest. So there's an incentive for a person to loan you that money in the first place. Credit is going to become more available, and credit is really the lifeblood of economic growth. It allows businesses to borrow and thrive and build up inventories and make investments. New goods and ideas are going to come from not only the interaction amongst the Mediterranean, but there's also going to be greater contact throughout the world. This is the era of the exploration of the Americas. By the late 1400s, early 1500s, the Spanish are bringing back gold and silver from the New World, as well as a variety of plants and animals and diseases, which are known as the Columbian Exchange. Finally, the Crusades are kind of, in a way, paying off. Those interactions that Christian Europeans had in the Holy Lands and the broader Islamic world, they're now bringing those ideas and technologies and innovations back, and it's beginning to circulate throughout European society. Broadly speaking, this is a time of urbanization, a term you should be familiar with. The growth of cities. More people are leaving the countryside, still a lot of people in the countryside. In fact, the vast majority of human beings are in the countryside because most of life revolves around food production. But a slightly greater percentage are going to be moving there. And you're going to begin to see some greater economic stability, which is going to pay off with some political stability. Please don't think this is a peaceful time. Nation-states, city-states are going to be at war with each other. There's going to be a fair amount of violence, but a little bit more stability than had been known prior to that. Renaissance concepts. Urban life. You should begin to know that if more people are living in cities, even if it's a fractional amount more, there's going to be more of a desire to cultivate and improve urban life. It's going to become more cosmopolitan, more diverse. More people are going to become involved in civic life. There's going to be more money in circulation for things like beautification and entertainment that's going to go on in cities. And an active citizenship, particularly amongst the wealthy. The wealthy are going to set themselves up in cities, in large palaces and buildings, homes of many kind. And they're going to establish or reestablish a lot of those patron-client relationships that you would have seen back in ancient Greece and Rome. Wealthy people picking people in society to do things for them in exchange for a loyalty, material or otherwise. Greater education. I don't want to overplay this point too much. I don't want you to think that there's suddenly this broad system of public schools and access to education for the average person. Not the case. But if you are, at a young age, showing any sign of aptitude or intelligence, your odds, especially in northern Italy, are going to be increased that you might get scooped up by some benefactor, some person who is looking for a young person who might be proficient in some sort of skill. So your ability to get access to an education goes up a little bit at the margin. Religion, still very important. Still the center of most people's lives, especially if you're not in the intellectual community. But blind faith, total unquestioned allegiance to religious bodies, kind of sees a bit of a decline during this time period. There's an emerging scientific and intellectual communities throughout Europe. And you're going to see in those communities a little bit more willingness to challenge the doctrines, dogmas, and belief of the church. There's going to be a little bit more freedom and room to do so. And that's going to lead to conflict. If you had to familiarize yourself with one very important term about the Renaissance, one very important value, rather, it would be humanism. Humanism is kind of a flexible term that could have different meanings in different contexts, but broadly speaking, it's a value where one emphasizes man's ability over that of religious authority. Human values and accomplishments. The value of the individual is raised in humanism. If one is a humanist, one is more likely to celebrate the accomplishments of an individual. They will be more likely to defend the idea that you should do something for personal self-fulfillment. And they will really stress the importance of one's own conscience, one's own individual belief, that may vary from a political or religious leader or institution. And as you begin to get more of a value of humanism, as this begins to permeate and settle in amongst intellectual circles, educated people in higher up positions in society are going to be more likely to challenge authority in various types, religious, political, and otherwise. These images here, I think, kind of reinforce that idea of humanism. The guy on the left here is an individual named Cesare Borgia. He's going to be the son of a very powerful pope during the late 1400s, and he's going to be a political player, so to speak, within the Italian city-states during his life. The other is a very important political player in Renaissance Florence, Lazzaro de' Medici. Both of these individuals were very powerful in their life. And they had their portraits done, many portraits done, as a way of kind of making permanent their existence and leaving a kind of an immortal record of who they were. This is something that really radiates humanism and the Renaissance, the idea that individuals, wealthy individuals, politically connected individuals would get their portrait done as a way of kind of celebrating their own individuality and commemorating themselves to history. This is a quick reinforcement of something we talked about yesterday. You should know this connection, though. During the Renaissance, you're going to see a more glorification of men or man as the individual, but there's going to be this desire to connect with the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome. Many in the intellectual community during the Renaissance are going to see the Middle Ages, the medieval world, as a divergence, as a detour, a mistaken detour that kind of threw humanity and European civilization off, and that if you reconnected with the philosophy and ideas of the ancients, meaning the Greeks and the Romans, to the Europeans, these were the prominent ancient societies, that society would improve and that should be the goal. of society. At the core of all of this rebirth going on in the Renaissance is really a story of economics. Economics really underpins all of these advancements in art and philosophy and politics and science and medicine. Because if you don't have the economics really right, if you don't have that foundation of economic growth, nothing else really falls into place. So the key players in that economic growth are the Italian merchants, who are going to become pretty wealthy during this time period. Church officials as well, who are going to be pretty well connected financially during this time period, in the Italian city-states. And there's going to be a growing competition amongst these wealthy merchants, merchant class, so to speak, to display their wealth. And that's kind of what you do when you become wealthy in this time period, is you want to separate yourself socially, materially, from people who aren't, as a way of kind of showing that you've arrived. And to do so, these wealthy merchants are going to look to artists and sculptors and architects to design for them fabulously ornate palaces and places to live. And they're going to establish networks of artists and sculptors and architects to make for them this reality. You're going to see the growth of new trade markets and the wider availability of credit, and as we talked about, better bookkeeping practices. At the core of these better bookkeeping practices is figuring out how best to calculate interest. Because interest is what gives the incentive to give out loans and credit to people, which fuels economic growth. So I want you to keep that thought in mind as we watch this short clip. Another is charged for the service of currency conversion, and as a way can kind of charge that out as a form of interest. We saw this image yesterday of kind of the capturing of all sorts of Renaissance things going on, the wider availability of coins, of knowledge in the form of books, the type of artwork with detail we see here. That really reflects a lot of these changes going on. I want to quick breeze through these quick ones here. In the Renaissance, in art, you'll see a value on a lot of the things we talked about yesterday. Classical models from Greek and Roman times. Capturing subjects in a more realistic form. Stay with me, we've still got 2 minutes. Portraits of nature, of children, kind of de-emphasizing Christian scenery and images. There's still going to be a fair amount of that, but less of it than before. And artists will have the opportunity to gain recognition and become kind of quasi-celebrities in their day and age and establish very powerful clients or patrons as well. And the use of perspective and human anatomy. Quickly, I wanted to draw this distinction. If you look broadly at Renaissance art, you'll see a distinction between what goes on in Italy versus what goes on in the other parts of Northern Europe. In Italy, there's more of an emphasis on Greek and Rome, scenery and subjects, more emphasis on nude figures as well as frescoes and wall and ceiling paintings. In the north, you're going to see more of an emphasis on everyday life and oil paintings, scenes like this. And I just want to close with this term. We'll come back to it a little bit. You're going to see in the Renaissance a rise in what we call secularization. Not amongst everybody. Religion is still going to be a huge part of people's life, but amongst intellectuals, there's going to be an increasing secular view of the world, not having a religious or spiritual basis. That's what that means. An emphasis on what can be done to improve this world, not so much the afterlife. Thanks for staying with me. Have a good weekend. Please exit through the library.